Have you ever, I don't know, just stopped and thought about how much we don't know? Like, science is amazing, don't get me wrong, but there's so much out there that's just plain weird, right? The stuff that doesn't fit the mold, the things textbooks kind of just brush aside.
It's true, isn't it? And you, our listeners, you sent in a fascinating pairing of sources for us to dive into today. The Book of the Damned by Charles Ford and excerpts from The Law of One.
Yeah, these two sources seem like they're coming from totally different universes, right? One's a collection of all these bizarre events that most people just dismiss, and the other is about, well, cosmic unity, the nature of reality itself, pretty heady stuff.
And yet that's what makes this deep dive so exciting. As we've been prepping, it's become clear that both sources, in their own way, challenge the limits of what we think we know, how we perceive the world even.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. The Book of the Damned and the Law of One together. What happens when we bring these two seemingly contradictory viewpoints into conversation? Can we learn something new about our quest for understanding, maybe even about reality itself?
Well, let's start with The Book of the Damned. Charles Fort, now there was a character, spent years poring over scientific journals, old newspapers, you name it, collecting all these reports of strange occurrences, things that just didn't fit the accepted narrative.
Rains of fish, objects falling from the sky. It's like a cabinet of curiosities, but for all the things science says shouldn't exist. And what's so interesting is Fort's main argument. He basically says that science has this built-in bias.
Oh, absolutely. He calls it false exclusions.
Yeah.
Science, Ford argues, tends to focus on the data that fits its existing theories and conveniently ignores or even outright rejects anything that doesn't fit. It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
He even uses this really interesting term, intermediateness. It's this idea that some phenomena exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully real nor unreal. They're kind of striving to become real, and science, by excluding them, is trying to maintain a sense of order, a clear picture, even if that picture is incomplete.
That's a brilliant insight. And Ford, he doesn't just talk about this in abstract terms. He gives us mountains of examples, this damn data, like unusual rains, for instance. He mentions a black rain in Switzerland back in 1911, a shower of ink in 1888.
And red rains, multiple accounts, one in the Mediterranean in 1888 and even one in Blankenberg, Holland, way back in 1819. And they actually analyzed the red rain in that case. You know what they found? No sand.
Really? So much for the windblown dust from the desert theory.
Right. They said it contained myria of cobalt. And another account described it as having this red-violet hue, which is just bizarre. It's like, what is going on here?
Then there are the falls of organic matter, like the Kentucky phenomenon of 1876. Fort describes flakes of something that looked like beef falling from a clear sky in Bath County. And this wasn't a widespread thing, mind you. It was limited to a very specific area, like 100 by 50 yards. Makes you wonder about those whirlwind explanations.
And it wasn't just meat. Fort talks about falls of seeds, gelatinous substances, even flour-like lumps that people used to make bread, though he says it was tasteless. And the typical explanation that it's manna, a type of lichen from Asia Minor. Fort really challenges that. He's like, come on, how can you explain all these different occurrences with one very specific thing from one corner of the world?
It does seem like a bit of a stretch.
Right. And then we have the falls of inanimate objects. Limestone pebbles falling with hail in France in June, no less. A sandstone pebble completely embedded in a beech tree in England. Fort suggests it must have fallen red hot to do that. Falls of cinders in Australia, on a light ship, even near Ottawa.
And let's not forget the resinous and bituminous matter. He talks about a fall in 1838 where the substance was soft, cuttable, and had this strong bituminous odor. It's just not something you see every day.
No, it's not. And then there are the living creatures. Small frogs, almost white, falling in Birmingham. Ants falling in huge numbers in multiple locations, some with wings, some without. And of course, the classic image of fish raining down.
Oh yes, the fish. I always find those accounts fascinating, even a little unsettling.
Right. And Fort even points out the problems with the usual whirlwind explanation. Like, wouldn't a whirlwind pick up other things too? Not just frogs, mud, debris, all that. And why are the frogs sometimes described as being almost albino?
Yeah.
It just raises more questions than it answers.
And then things get really strange, with falls of manufactured objects. Thunderstones, he calls them, often beautifully crafted stone tools. He mentions an iron cannonball found after a thunderstorm and the fact that it wasn't considered a real thunderstone because it wasn't a meteorite. And the falls of quartz, which he says science seems to have in its index prohibitory.
As if quartz just isn't allowed to fall from the sky. It's amazing. He talks about a case where a white meteorite turned out to be a fragment of a quartz boulder, and the reaction was basically, well, everyone knows quartz doesn't fall from the sky.
It's that kind of rigid thinking, that unwillingness to even consider the possibility of something outside the established framework that Fort is challenging.
And it goes even further. He mentions a pyramidal stone wedge that fell in Ireland with ruler straight lines on the crust, a disc of worked stone in France, a block of metal found embedded in coal. These are the things that make you go, huh, that's not supposed to be there.
Precisely. And then there's this other idea, the concept of continuity,
Yeah.
that Fort keeps coming back to. It's the idea that everything is connected, everything blends into everything else, so it's impossible to draw hard lines between categories. He points out how science tried to assimilate these strange events with things we already know, like the substance that fell at Memel, which they compared to marsh growth, even though it had a fibrous texture like paper.
It's like trying to fit the universe into a set of neat little boxes and then getting frustrated when things spill over.
Exactly. And that leads us to his critique of science, trying to understand the universal in terms of the local. He compares it to trying to understand something vast, like Russia or India, based on your limited experience of a small island. It highlights the inherent limitations of our perspective.
So we've got this mountain of damned data. Where does the law of one fit into all of this? I mean, it's a completely different kind of source, but it's also about pushing the boundaries of what we know, isn't it?
It is. What's fascinating is that the law of one, even though it's channeled information, even though it's very metaphysical, also suggests a reality that's way more complex than what conventional science would have us believe. Rott talks about our third density reality as being fundamentally an illusion, a kind of veil that limits our perception of the one infinite creator.
So in a way, Fort's damned data could be seen as little cracks in that veil, right?
I think so, yes. Glimpses of something beyond our limited understanding. And Fort talks about this super Sargasso Sea, this place where all sorts of things are just floating around, suspended. Could that be, in some way, a metaphor for what Ra describes as interplanetary regions with water, maybe even life? It's an interesting connection to think about.
It really is. And Fort also talks about regularized and tramp vessels or planets. These vagabonds that don't follow the rules, that astronomers might be missing because they don't fit the established patterns. Does that resonate with anything in the Law of One?
It certainly does. Ra talks about hidden aspects of reality, things that our current scientific models just haven't grasped yet.
Yeah.
Both sources, despite their differences, point towards a reality that's much richer, much more multifaceted than we tend to acknowledge.
And yet, their approaches are so different. Fort's all about observation, about meticulously collecting these often very strange anecdotes. Ra, on the other hand, dives straight into metaphysical explanations, cosmic
It's
principles.
like the difference between listing symptoms and diagnosing the underlying condition, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. Fort's focused on the what, and Ra's offering the why.
And their attitudes towards authority are quite different too. Fort's skeptical, almost distrustful, of scientific authority and its tendency to dismiss anything that doesn't fit the mold. Ra, while presenting a certain authority, offers their information as a gift of understanding for those who are seeking, not as some absolute truth.
That makes sense. And Fort has this one line that really stuck with me. All seeming of existence perceptible to us is the product of exclusion.
It's a pretty profound statement. What do you think about that in the context of the law of one and Ra's concept of our reality as an illusion?
It's incredibly relevant, isn't it? If our perception is shaped by what we filter out, then our understanding of reality is bound to be incomplete, maybe even distorted. The veil that Ra talks about serves a similar purpose. It's like our everyday consciousness is actively filtering out a much bigger, more unified reality.
So both sources are saying, in their own way, that what we perceive as real is only a small sliver of a much larger picture. That's right. And it makes you wonder about all the things we might be missing, the pieces of the puzzle we've thrown away because they didn't seem to fit.
And could that be why we're so drawn to the unexplained? To these strange events, these anomalies?
It's certainly a possibility. Maybe it's that innate sense of wonder, that feeling that there's more to the story that keeps us searching.
Ra talks about wanderers, these souls who incarnate at this specific time, this harvest time, to help humanity remember lost knowledge. Could that be related to our struggle to understand Fort's damned data?
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Perhaps the wanderers are here to subtly guide us, to help us see beyond our ingrained exclusions, maybe even to challenge those neat little boxes we try to fit everything into.
Fort, writing way before the UFO craze, mentions supervessels and interplanetary traffic as potential explanations for some of the strange falls he documents. It's almost like he was anticipating the whole UFO phenomenon. What does Ra have to say about UFOs and contact?
Well, Ra distinguishes between different groups involved in these encounters. There's the Confederation, who operate on a principle of service to others, and the Orion Group, who are all about service to self. And they say that the key to understanding any contact experience is to look at the heart of the encounter, the effect it has on the individual.
So, not all UFO encounters are created equal.
Exactly. Confederation contact, according to Ra, is about encouraging seeking, about offering understanding but not giving all the answers. They've been around for millennia, they say, even influencing some of the stories in the Bible.
Whereas the Orion Group has a different agenda.
Indeed. They tend to focus on those they perceive as weaker-minded, trying to spread their own philosophy, maybe even establish control. Ra cautions against interaction with them, especially for those who are already highly polarized towards the positive.
Switching gears a bit, Fort mentions how scientists try to explain the mammal substance as some kind of marsh growth. Does that tendency to fit the unknown into existing frameworks show up in the Law of One at all? Maybe in relation to healing or energy?
Ra talks about crystal healing and how it's based on understanding the energetic structure of the physical body and aligning it with planetary and cosmic energies. The pyramid, for instance, is described as a tool for focusing light energy, for healing and manipulating oral forces. It's a different way of approaching energy, not about forcing it into familiar categories, but about understanding its deeper principles within a cosmic context. Okay, last question. Fort talks about progress as this ongoing attempt to become more real, more stable, more organized. How does that relate to Ra's concept of the harvest and the evolution of consciousness through different densities? That's a fascinating parallel. Fort's idea of striving for realness could be seen as a reflection on a material level of the soul's journey towards a deeper understanding of the law of one. Ra describes density evolution as a process of moving towards greater unity, greater comprehension, culminating in the harvest into higher densities. And they say the current harvest on Earth is particularly challenging because of what they call scattered thought forms. We need more alignment, both individually and collectively.
So Fort's talking about becoming real in a physical sense, and Ra's talking about a more spiritual evolution and alignment of energy.
Exactly.
Well, there you have it, folks. The Book of the Damned and the Law of One. Two very different perspectives that, when you bring them together, paint a surprisingly cohesive and definitely thought-provoking picture.
Absolutely. They both challenge us to question our assumptions, to be open to possibilities that might seem strange, even impossible at first glance.
The Book of the Damned makes us question what science chooses to ignore, the data that gets swept under the rug. And the Law of One gives us a framework, a cosmic perspective to try and understand the bigger picture.
And that's the beauty of this deep dive, isn't it? The contrast between these two sources forces us to think critically, to consider different ways of knowing, different ways of approaching the mysteries of the universe.
So our challenge to you, dear listeners, is this. What other damn data might be out there waiting to be rediscovered, re-examined? What are we collectively excluding that could lead us to a more complete, a more profound understanding of reality, of ourselves, of the law of one?
What seemingly impossible things might actually be true if we only dare to look beyond the veil.
Keep seeking, keep questioning, keep wondering. That's what this deep dive is all about. Until next time, stay curious.